Good morning. Sorry, there's something enormously ironic about giving a talk about post-industrial journalism with so much electronic equipment, much of which doesn't work as it should. First of all, I want to say thank you very much indeed to the International Journalism Festival for having me here. This is actually the first time, I think, I was going to say it's the first time I've ever said anything in a church. I think I did get married, so it's probably not absolutely the first time I've said something in a church, but certainly the first time I've said anything in a church where I wasn't worried that the outcome was going to ruin the rest of my life. My marriage is still very good after all those years. So, my name's Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. The centre's inside the J School, so we do a number of things. I teach at the J School, so does my fellow professor in the Tower Centre. We have a research programme which looks into, called the Town Light Projects, which we've just launched, which looks into areas of interest, particularly around data transparency and impact in the digital age. And we also look at convening and generating conversations around what's going on in the field at the moment, because we are, as you know, living through a ridiculously exciting time. Before I came to Columbia, I was a journalist. I've been a career journalist, I've been a print journalist, and I've been an online journalist. I was a business reporter for a number of years, and in 2000, I moved from the Observer newspaper, which is a Sunday newspaper in Britain, to The Guardian, where I became the head of Guardian Online, sort of the editor-in-chief of the websites, and then later on the director of digital content. And between 2000 and 2010, we did a great deal of things at The Guardian that were, I think, sort of quite innovative at the time. I was lucky to do them in an organization which had great leadership and which had a slightly different business model than some of my counterparts in very commercial companies. We were owned by a trust. We didn't have to return profits to a shareholder. So it gave me an opportunity to try out and think about and work with teams who were trying very new things for what was then very new things in the field of journalism. Last year was our centennial year at the journalism school. That means that we had been going for 100 years. It was 100 years since Joseph Pulitzer gave Columbia money to start the journalism school. And we were commissioned by our dean, Nick Lemon, to produce a report which, and we were very careful never to use the phrase future of journalism in the report, because I think it's an overused phrase, and also because that suggested that we were going to come up with some solutions, which, if you read our 122-page report, Post-Industrial Journalism, you'll notice we cleverly avoid making very, very strong recommendations about what you should do with your newsroom. But we were commissioned a report to look at what we think is actually happening right now in journalism and how practices and existing institutions might adapt to that future. I co-authored the report with Clay Shirky, who many of you probably know from his work talking about and lecturing on the real-time social web. He's a professor also at NYU and works both in the ITP program there and the journalism program. And C.W. Anderson, he's Chris Anderson, but there are so many Chris Andersons, we now call him C.W., who's an academic who again teaches in CUNY J School, and his area of, or field of expertise is really looking at news organizations. He's just produced a book about the news ecology in Philadelphia. So it was a really sort of unique collaboration for us, because it was New York's 3 J schools coming together and looking at what we thought was going to happen, or was happening in front of our eyes. And we spent about 6 months. This is not a strictly speaking academic report. It's more like a long essay. And we spent about 6 months talking to 50+ individuals and organizations of all different types. Some of these are very traditional, large news agencies and news organizations. Some of them were sort of one-man bands or one-woman bands and startups. And throughout that sort of process, we gained, I think, a sort of a fairly interesting picture of what was happening in American journalism, and I hope some of that exports reasonably well to Europe and maybe even to the rest of the world. as I noticed we were being translated into Chinese last week. So I'm wondering what they... Bill Gruskin, our academic dean, on business models for digital journalism. Now, both those reports had a very key theme which ran through them, which is the age of high revenues coming into news is over, and it's not coming back. So our report was looking at what happens when you get into this downsized world, where you have to sort of start thinking about operating on much lower resources. It's not a report specifically about business models, but at the front of the report we say, we think that the advertising model is failing, and for subscription models, again, there is no necessary evidence that these are working either. What we think, though, is that this shift, if you like, in sizing of news organizations is permanent and irreversible. So whatever comes next has to have a different model, and it has to have a different size. The cost base for journalism will have to be much smaller. I don't think there's anybody now in the industry who thinks that this is even debatable. And it would be very surprising if news organizations were investing to grow the number of employees they have and to grow the basis on which they produce their work. So what I wanted to do this morning, actually, can I just retrieve my water so that I don't dry up completely? That one, thanks. What I wanted to do this morning was just talk through 3 or 4 of the top line points. I've got some alluring visuals for you, maybe. Oh, hang on, I've gone too far. Right, so, spoiled the joke. So first of all, why post-industrial? So the first observation that we made is the most obvious one, but we felt it really needed saying, which news journalism isn't an industry anymore. It just isn't. You used to be able to walk into the smallest local newspaper or local radio or television organization and the largest in the country, and they would kind of look more or less the same. You know, the production processes were all about getting stories from one end of the pipe to the other and producing packages. And they were produced in places like this. This is actually quite a modern newsroom. This is something that was sort of reconfigured, and I think it might even be the Telegraph newsroom in London. And this is sort of state-of-the-art. But this is not really fit for the future. If you think that, sorry, people on live stream, if you think that all reporting now, or you can report a story very effectively with an iPhone, then something like this begins to look incredibly outdated. So we really mean that the fragmentation of practices and downscaling of size means that while we still have a profession, we still have a field of journalism, but it's just not organized either on an industrial scale or as a recognizable set of processes which you can replicate everywhere with a predictable result. There's no longer, my colleague Clay would say, there is no longer such a thing as the press addressing such a thing as the public. Those models have gone. This is a very different world that we're working in. The rows of desks, the hundreds of people, are all going. What will they be replaced by? Well, I don't know how many of you have seen the new series on Netflix called House of Cards. But this is the newsroom from which our heroine, our fictional heroine, goes from a place called the Washington Herald, which has a newsroom very much like the previous slide, into something called Slugline, which is, as you can see, a small scrub space where journalists loll around on beanbags and post straight to the web. This is actually not really a fictional version of what goes on now in news production. This is pretty much what a lot of new newsrooms look like. They're stripped of infrastructure. I haven't finished watching House of Cards yet, but I do remember from the UK version it doesn't end very well. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is a remedy. This is a remedy for how all journalism will be done in the future. But I thought it was a very nice kind of modern trope from a series which was entirely made by, if you like, a disruptor. Netflix is not a major television production house. It constructed this series about, if you like, it is about post-industrial journalism and politics in the era of the individual. They made the series by carefully analyzing user data around all aspects of what people did with their platform. So they knew that people who liked political dramas also liked Kevin Spacey. Hence, Kevin Spacey was cast in the title role. They knew that people liked drama series of a certain length with a certain number of episodes, and that determined how the script was paced and how the series was built. As I say, it's a small illustration of how these things are happening elsewhere, which is, this feedback loop of data and what the audience wants fed into a creative process, which is not entirely, as I say, unlike what's happening to journalism. So, one of the other, so if you like, that's why we're calling it post-industrial. You can push back on that. I'm very happy for people to say that there is still an industry. The second thing, which is worth noting while we still have a new institution, or what we think a new institution might look like up on the screen, is that the old institutions are trying to adapt, but they're finding, we found that they find changing process a much higher barrier than not having the correct resources. In other words, there are plenty of news organizations who sort of know that they need to do things differently or are trying to do things differently. But often they're locked into processes, sometimes by dint of having integrated newsrooms or dominant legacy businesses, and sometimes because they've actually just established themselves working in routines that they find really, really hard to move out of. So when we were producing examples of how news could be done more efficiently, whether it's by database reporting or organizing your reporters slightly differently, we found that barriers like how your content management system worked were much, much greater than the fact that sort of people can't afford it. So money is not the issue. It's much more about shifting from one model which effectively is failing to another model which might work. You can see that, for instance, we looked at a number of, if you like, new entrants who were beginning to do the process that was previously sort of enshrined in these larger organizations. And there are a couple that we mentioned in the report, and there are many, 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 many others that we could talk about. So we talk about Homicide Watch, and we talk about SCOTUS blog as just two examples. Both of these are doing very different things, one in a very local area. Homicide Watch was set out with the idea of covering every single homicide that happens in DC. But it only had two journalists. It only had Laura and Chris Amico. And how do you cover a whole city and a number of murders with two people? Well, you have to do it differently. You can't do it in the same way that the Washington Post does it. They did it by building a database of every single incident, crime incident that they could track that involved a homicide. They used social media to alert them, and their own search logs to alert them as to when homicides had taken place. Laura sleeps with a police scanner by her bed. She's a traditional crime reporter, but she was doing the site in a very different way. It looks very different from how you would imagine the crime coverage of a daily metro newspaper to look. But it's also very effective. They gathered an incredibly large audience. It's not monetizable because people don't want to advertise against crime. It's not something that people are not going to pay for a service that tells them whether or not their relatives or friends have been shot. And even though it's very much done in a non-political way, it's also a deeply political site because you can always see who the latest victims are. And the latest victims, almost without exception, are always young black men. It tells you a very complete picture about what's happening in Washington in a completely different way to how a crime desk would. Why doesn't the Washington Post do something like this? Well, the Washington Post produced its own sort of glossy interactive crime map, but I don't think that they would ever absorb the processes that Chris and Laura use because it's so different from what they're used to doing. And then the second example here is SCOTUS blog, which is a very niche blog in America that covers the Supreme Court. and it's run by a husband and wife team who actually subsidize it from their own law firm. But it's become the single most important news source for everything about what's going on in the Supreme Court. On the morning when the Supreme Court handed down their decision about Obamacare and whether it was illegal or illegal, SCOTUS blog had 1 million visits in about 5 minutes. And it reported the news accurately, whereas rather famously, CNN got the decision wrong for about 10 minutes because they didn't really have the expertise in law to understand what the complexity, what the decision really meant, because it was a complex and very sort of legalese process, and it couldn't be told instantly by non-specialist journalists. Now, both of these types of site, and I could have put up Syria Deeply, I could have put up Tehran Bureau, I could have put up Storyful, I could have put up Storyfy, any number of news startups doing different things and said these all replace bits of what old institutions did. The problem that we identified in the report is that the new institutions are also weak. You know, that their sustainability is not guaranteed, and that we need some kind of both. It's very important for news to have longevity and to have strength and depth in terms of accountability reporting, in terms of always being in a community where people can recognize you. So we're not saying, you know, this is a great moment in which all the old dinosaurs can slink off into the whatever they had in those days, probably a forest, I don't know, and die, and the new institutions will automatically replace them. In fact, in the report, we say there is a sort of a nightmare scenario where everything is broken and the new ecosystem is too weak to survive on its own. And I think we have to recognize that as a very real and present danger. So even though we have a great deal of money going into startups, many more empowered and new ideas, we also have this problem of sustainability. That hasn't gone away. Trying to do this with one hand is slightly more difficult than I thought. Hold on. Here we go. So if the future then is about this mixed ecology, we also made another kind of, if you like, sort of key observation, which is that the power shift is actually changing from the institution and the brand in news to the individual. Again, this may not seem like sort of anything that's particularly new, but we think it's a really important and fundamental change. And we think it's one that the news industry hasn't really spent nearly enough time thinking about. It doesn't mean that institutions aren't needed, quite the opposite. As I say, you know, you actually need strength and depth and longevity to be able to hold power to account, because power has length and strength and longevity. But it does mean that news has to be more a sort of a smart node and a hub for the human activity that makes up reporting and discussion of news. A recent Pew survey, I don't know whether you saw it, in the States said that 75% of people discover their news by word of mouth, which is a really interesting statistic because it both says absolutely nothing and a great deal all at the same time. Which is, if 75% of people are really getting their news through word of mouth rather than sitting in front of a TV screen or hearing the radio or opening up a newspaper in the morning, that tells us that something really fundamental has shifted about how we share and disseminate news. I was also at a social media gathering last week where somebody shared the statistic that in the olden days where you just had, if you like, sort of the early days of Web 1 publishing, you had a blog or a website where people could comment. About 10% of anyone who ever sort of interacted with the news ever did anything. In other words, you know, there was only about 1% of people who would comment. Another 9% of people might bookmark something or be active about sharing or emailing links, but it was a very, very small proportion. Last year, the number of people who did some sort of activity around news, whether they put a like on a page, whether they emailed it, whether they shared it, whether they posted it to their Facebook page, was nearer to 76%. Now, it's hard to verify that statistic, but if it's true, again, that's a really enormous change in how we see news being disseminated and discussed. And this is among personal networks. This is not again, through a sort of an industrial process. It's through a different type of network. I mean, you know, it's highly observable, not that far from here. This is one of my favorite pictures so far of this year. Does anybody know what that is? Pope, yes, it is the Pope. This is how, this is St. Peter's Square when there was white smoke. And you don't need a satellite truck in St. Peter's Square to tell you that there is white smoke. You know, because every single one of those people and every single one of those devices is relaying that information back into their networks. And that is where news is breaking. So news gathering is done now instantaneously. Breaking news is done by the crowd. You know, we don't need lots of journalists there to tell us that there's white smoke. And dissemination as well is increasingly done by personal interactions. For context, meaning enterprise reporting and telling the stories that can't either be told by the crowd or assembled by the algorithm, then we still want to and need to trust our news brands. But on the real-time social web, just as the atomic unit of news really shifted from being the page or the paper or the bulletin into being the story, and the story is now fragmenting into tweets and pictures and aggregated content like this. So journalism is shifting from being a packaged product to the journalist, to the actual individual journalist. I recently had a really smart senior executive from a growing journalism business focused in sport come in to talk to my class, and we talk about digital news strategies and what's working and what's not working. And he was describing such an incredible picture of growth. More people watch sport than ever before, certainly in my house. Goes on all the time. More people are playing fantasy league. More people are sharing their own sort of views and statistics about, you know, the games that they're interested in. So it seemed to me that he had a pretty bomb-proof business model. And I was saying, well, so what are the things that keep you awake at night? And he said, well, I'll tell you what keeps me awake at night. Oh, no, not him, sorry. He probably puts him to sleep at night. He said, Jay-Z keeps me awake at night. I said, this is very interesting. Why does Jay-Z keep you awake at night? And he said, well, there's a game they play in the United States called basketball, which is very, very popular. It's a little bit like soccer, but not as good. Football, but not as good. And Jay-Z, the rapper, owns a significant stake in a very bad baseball team called the Brooklyn Nets. I'm a Knicks fan, so they are a very bad team. And he's selling it. And my classroom guest said, the value has gone from the league to the franchise to the player. And Jay-Z is selling his stake in the Brooklyn Nets so that he can become an agent, so that he can deal with individual players rather than franchises, which frankly are vanity projects, but they're never going to make you any money. Now, I'm not suggesting for 2 seconds that, let's go back, Andrew Sullivan equates with Lionel Messi or LeBron James. But in a way, this is also happening in journalism. So, you know, Andrew Sullivan has gone from being somebody who worked for a very big news brand. He worked for things like the Sunday Times in the UK, I think it was Time magazine, etc. New Republic, it was his home for a while. Then he moved about 18 months ago to the Daily Beast, which was a new startup coming out of Newsweek. And then 6 months ago, he decided that he was going to go it alone. You know, and he's kind of he's a sort of the canary down the mine of post-industrial journalism, because he's saying, look, I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I think I have as good a shot at doing this now by myself as I do inside an institution. Now, there are two pressures on that, one of which is his desire to do what he wants to do, and the other pressure is obviously the economic pressure that's being felt by large publishers, which means that they can't any longer sustain the big salaries and the infrastructures that used to previously go with some of the top jobs in journalism. So we have, let me just get past, back to Jay-Z. I think that this shift to individualism in journalism is really, really, really important. Everything about how we think about journalism, about how to organize it, what we need to support it, and what we expect journalists to do. One of the many things that I'm sure people who are actively involved in journalism here have been thinking about is probably how to reorganize your newsroom and how to do things differently. I know that I was involved in a similar process. Everybody I know has been through that cycle at some point in the last 10 years, whether they work in TV, radio, or print, or magazines. But the aim has always been about serving the needs of the brand or the company. We never started that thought process with what are we going to allow the individual journalist to do? How are we going to give them the right tools so that they can exercise their agency in all of these new and better and more efficient ways? So as I say, I think that we really think that if there's one message from the entire report, it should be about how you configure those work processes and how you start to rethink your organization. I think that individual journalists, assemble increasingly around projects, and our structures for news, for industrial news, are really structured around products. So we make no guesses about what does the new newsroom look like, where should everybody sit, and what should they be doing. We think that that's down to very much your individual organization and what they really want to achieve or what they want to do. But I do think that despite that despite the lack of advice in that area, I would say if you're thinking about a modern news organization, you need to start thinking about something which is more like a studio system or more like a talent agency model, more like a network which can have loose ties to scattered individuals and tight ties to a few who are very, very important to your brand than it is to think about something which actually contains a process. And what does it mean for the individual journalist? And I think this is something else which is critical to what we think about at journalism school and ought to be critical to newsrooms in terms of thinking about if we want to survive, who should we be employing as well? One of the answers to that, my slides have gone. Come back. Sorry. Back. So one of the answers to this is sort of specialization, which I'll come to in a minute. And one of the things that we see these are just 3 examples, slightly sort of grainily, poorly pixelated, of, again, how we see this happening at the moment. So I do apologize, these are all men. I suddenly realized when I finished my slide this morning, these are all men, that's very bad, though Homicide Watch is run by women, so I feel slightly better about that. So at the top we have Nate Silver. Anyone from America will know who Nate Silver is, probably most people outside are not quite sure. Nate Silver was a blogger, he was a sports stats blogger originally. He had a piece of software which helped tell you predict outcomes in baseball, which I can't really think of anything more boring than that, but that's what he did. And he translated some of his skills as a statistician into political forecasting and modeling. And he began a blog called 538. The New York Times, in probably the smartest single piece of business that the New York Times has ever done, decided a couple of years out from the election that they would buy Nate Silver and his blog, that they would franchise it into the New York Times, and he would become one of the components of their political blogging effort in the run-up to the 2012 election. What actually happened was he became absolutely the most talked about single journalist in the whole of America for 2 reasons. One of which is he actually got the outcome of the election right. And secondly, because he never attended the White House meetings, he didn't go in the plane with Obama, he had a different method of reporting, and this became something of a touchstone, and if you like, a sort of a debate between an old way of doing things and a new way of doing things in the States. But I think the important thing about him is the relationship that he has with the New York Times, which is not that of a conventional employee. He has maintained some of the brand and the franchise and the blog name. He has a level of authority and independence which operates outside even a mega brand like the New York Times. The second person down there's just a clip from Seth Mnuchin's Twitter feed. Twitter is a brilliant journalistic platform. Sadly, it was not built by a journalistic organization, but it is a brilliant journalistic platform. Seth is a journalist who is not a local journalist, but happened to get caught up in the chase for the Boston bombing suspects last week. He is a journalist. He's also a professor at MIT. He teaches and writes about science. But for that evening, he pursued and reported on everything he saw in front of him through his Twitter feed. And Twitter enables that because it enables the individual to have that direct relationship with a wide network of people. It allows them to link to and to post information very quickly in real time. And he quickly became one of 3 or 4 sources that everybody followed that evening because he had authority, because he was reporting and verifying as he went, because he had a conversational tone and he was answering people's requests. He was telling you when his battery was dying. He was telling you what he knew and what he didn't know. And then the third example, which is he'll be very surprised and quite pleased that I've put this up there here, is just actually one of my students who, for a classroom exercise, I set my students the task of trying to imagine an audience target for themselves of some description. And it doesn't have to be a large number, but it has to be a meaningful number, and then achieve it. And actually, the way he did it was make a rather clever viral video, which he posted on BuzzFeed. And the crucial point about this is that platforms now and organizations like BuzzFeed, Deadspin, some of the Gawker sites in America as well, are starting to develop platform software which enables, if you like, people to be more than just commenters, but also to be contributors. And actually, it's worth saying that my student got 3 paid-for commissions from South African media just off the clip that he posted on BuzzFeed. And he became one of their top 50 contributors. And he achieved this just out of a classroom exercise. And he was able to do it because BuzzFeed are thinking, our hub is always going to be quite small, but our spokes are going to be very long, and our spokes have to support individuals who want to create and share and make different types of news. So that's why I use those 3. And as I say, a lot of this revolves around specialization. So when we get to what do we teach in our journalism schools and how do we think about these new skills, I think it's correct and comfortable to say the core skill will always be recognizing and telling a story. But the ability now to do that resides on much more than the ability to produce 700 words or a 2-minute script. It really relies on journalists knowing a great deal about the technical infrastructure and the networks that they're working within. What is the crowd saying? What's happening in St. Peter's Square? What's on Twitter? Who else is creating this content? What about that discussion over there on Reddit? All of those things have to be held in a journalist's head. A journalist also has to know what's automatically going to be done by something else. Where do I spend my time most usefully? Where do I add most value to this? Those are kind of critical thinking skills that we haven't really asked individual journalists to exercise before, and we're asking them to exercise them now. So you might be a brilliant narrative writer. That is a specialization, I think, but you will just have to be really, really good if you want a career writing narrative, because you can't rely. Your audience is everybody who's consuming narrative writing everywhere, so you have to be especially good. It could be that your speciality is geography or location. It could be that your speciality is in data mining, presentation. It could be that your speciality is in developing and making news apps. It might be that your speciality is in aggregation. It might be that your speciality is in healthcare and the pharmaceuticals industry. It might be that your speciality, if you work for BuzzFeed, is in finding really, really great pictures of cats that look like world leaders. But it is a world of specialization. One of the things that we're doing at Columbia is we teach one of the only courses in the world which combines a graduate degree in computer science and a graduate degree in journalism, which is intended to really be a very highly specialized degree for people who will work sort of absolutely at the forefront of making platforms and thinking about solutions for journalism from a technological point of view. It's a small program, but it's interesting how fast applications are growing for it. Because these are skills that actually not everybody out there has. And these are skills where we have to sort of start to think, if we want to remake the field, we have to have those within the profession of journalism rather than relying on other people. Because whilst what they might make is good, it won't be for journalism. And we definitely need more of that. So I was just going to sort of finish off quickly, because I was kind of, I'm over time by now. But I just wanted to show you something so you're not all completely in a let's say, a slough of despond about this, which is, I've been following the events in Boston very, very, very closely this week, and I was alerted last night by a tweet from my boss, Bill Gruskin, at the J School. And he just put one sort of line up, which he said, this story is really amazing, with a link to it. And I clicked on it. And it's a story by Eric Moskowitz, who's one of the reporters on the Boston Globe. And it's worth saying that the Boston Globe has done, not all of the reporting on the Boston bombings, but it's been a really phenomenal resource, as has Boston.com, which deployed lots of different techniques and tools to tell the story. But when I clicked on it, what it was an exclusive interview with the guy who was abducted by the suspects and who later escaped. And he didn't want his real identity revealing. He's just called Danny in the piece. And he talked to Eric and a criminologist from Boston University for 2.5 hours. And they got out of him this sort of remarkably rich testimony about what actually happened on that night. And it's just a text story. There are no links in it. There is no video that goes with it. There's no sound that goes with it. But it's a story told from a position of a place where only a journalist could go. And it was told to a journalist because the source trusted him with the information and to present it in the right way. So as I say, we hear a lot here about new techniques and aggregation. We hear a lot about new platforms and tools. I've just spent half an hour telling you to absolutely remake everything, to configure it around, to configure your newsrooms and configure your skills around new specializations. But it's worth remembering as well that journalism is really, really important. And now it's a very, very important time, and I don't need to say that, to any of the Italian journalists here who've worked in really sort of exceptional and difficult circumstances in the last few years. So our report contains many suggestions, but it also contains right at the end one request. And we say that this is the most important thing that anyone in journalism can do in the next few years. And it's distilled down into one word, and the word is survive. Anyway, thank you. Oh, do I need that? Okay.
Wow, thank you. That was very catastrophic for us.
Catastrophic?
Journalists, yes.
Good. I like to be catastrophic on a Saturday morning. There's nothing like it.
I received a ton of questions,
okay.
And I have tons of my own. So how we're going to proceed like this. I mean, I will ask people to raise their hand if they have questions they want to ask here. Otherwise, I will start reading the questions I received online on Twitter. And I see someone already raising his hand. Please, do we have another microphone for the people in the room? No. We need you to have a microphone, so I think I'm going to have to give you mine. Because this is all in streaming, so.
Hi, Michael or Michael Freund from Vienna. This may be a bit marginal, but I read your report, and you dealt with the New York Times only briefly, saying the Times is in a league of its own.
Ignore it.
It's not going to be one of those media companies we talk about. What makes you think that? I mean, the Time is in the same competitive environment as everybody else. They have problems like everybody else. They're firing reporters.
It's not actually what we say. So what we say is, it's very tempting, particularly in American journalism, to talk about the New York Times endlessly. and to say the New York Times does this, the New York Times does that. But the New York Times is an outlier. It has a really sort of specific set of market circumstances. It has a very specific audience and resource and cost base attached to it. So we can talk about the New York Times, but it's just what we didn't want to get into was this, and it's very specific to American journalism, of people just switching off and saying, oh, but it's all very well to talk about the New York Times, but the New York Times is not typical of our paper and what we do. And I think that we just wanted to get that out of the way and say we recognize that it is brilliant and that it is unique, but it is exactly that. It is unique. It is not a model for the rest of American journalism, and there are many, many other things going on that we need to discuss and talk about. So we didn't say it's not the future. We just said we think it's, and actually in America, everybody has congratulated us on that strategic move. So, you know, as I say, I think that there's, we didn't want to be too New York-centric. You know, we're in New York. America is almost more tribal than Europe. So the East Coast and the West Coast are not necessarily the best of friends all the time.
Not to mention those in between.
Not to mention those in between, but there's a very, you know, so it was important not to make it problematic as an example.
A main question that arrived on Twitter from many young people, and many of them are here, is, I mean, how can a young, aspiring journalist learn to become a journalist if individualism prevails? I mean, is going to a journalism school the only solution?
I think going to a journalism school is more important than it was, as long as you're going to a good one, and I know there are plenty of very good ones out there. I didn't go to journalism school. The dean of the school didn't go to journalism school. Many of my colleagues didn't go to journalism schools, but I was trained. You know, I went into an organization where there was training, where people had time to train. And I actually talked with 2 weeks ago, Michael Wolff, who's a rather spiky media commentator, wrote a very spiky piece about Columbia Journalism School and said, why would you ever go to journalism school, full stop? And I invited him up to talk to our students, because I said they'd be very interested to talk to you about this, Michael, because they don't necessarily agree with everything that you say. And one of my students, I think one of our students, said something really, really sort of that pinned it. And he said, you know, this school is 43% international, which it is now. It's not just American journalists. He said, I came here for 2 reasons, one of which is I can learn things that are not necessarily happening or applicable in and I can take them back to my home market. He said, the second thing I could do is I get a network here of people who will go and work all over the world, of professors who know what they're talking about, and of other sort of, if you like, we have an incredibly strong relationship with all of the news organizations in New York, as to CUNY, as to NYU. I get this network, and in this new world, I will need that network to help me do my job. So journalism school isn't the only option, but I think one of the reasons I went from The Guardian to Columbia was because I do think that there is now an opportunity, and it may not last for long, but it's certainly true now, that journalism schools have always followed the profession. We've always trained journalists to do existing jobs and to think in the same way that existing organizations want them to think. I think in the future, for the next, you know, sort of 5 to 10 years at least, journalism schools have to do more than that. They have to do a lot more than that. We have to really sort of produce people who can lead the industry and who can do things differently and can be sustainable in a different world where maybe they are working on their own or they're working with loosely collaborative sets of colleagues and networks. And that's a big change for us as well. You know, we have to think about how important that bit of the ecosystem is. And we have to think about how making that kind of education is available and affordable, because, you know, it's really expensive. And, you know, as well as going from the newspaper business to the higher education business, you're almost sort of hopping from one kind of bubble to the next. But I do think that there's a changed role, and I think that most intelligent organizations who are teaching young journalists now recognize that and are modifying what they do as a result.
Now, there's also publishers asking questions. I mean, a publisher is saying, okay, so the news industry is finished, but what should a publisher do to readapt with success to the new ecosystem of information?
So stop doing all the same things over and over again is probably one thing. I mean, if you have a robust business model and you don't have to worry about it, that's fine. You know, we see plenty of journalists who come from markets where news is booming and where advertising is still rising in newspapers rather than falling, where television networks are, you know, seeing, I mean, television networks in the States actually are kind of seeing very, very high profitability. But if you talk to the smarter TV executives, they're saying this is exactly what was happening in newspapers 10 years ago. And newspapers were very profitable. Everybody had bonuses. Nobody could quite understand how this disruption was really going to affect them. They all bought new buildings, new presses, invested more in both print and in digital, and now face, as a result, often closure and bankruptcy and withdrawal of print. So the first thing, if you're a publisher, is to think how best you can disrupt rather than protect, particularly if you're in a business where it's changing so quickly. That, you know, the second thing you have to do is think about all the very good things that one system produces, like longevity, sustainability, expertise, and try and think how it fits with the new system. I think in the past, particularly in newspapers, that's really sort of configured around this idea of integrating newsrooms. Integrating newsrooms were done to save costs and to help people do digital and analog printing in the same office. I was at a conference, a really good conference in America last week called the ISOJ conference in Austin. And there was a presenter there called Clark Gilbert, who comes from a very unusual local paper in Salt Lake City called the Deseret Times. And Clark Gilbert said, not only is integrating your newsroom to tie print and digital together a mistake, but if you have done it, ultimately, you're not going to survive, which was a step further than I've heard any other publisher sort of saying this, that actually the speed of digital iteration now is so fast and it's so different from, if you like, kind of, you know, the sort of browser-based web publishing that looks a little bit like newspapers, that to tie those two processes together is going to hold you back. And it ties you to a model which isn't going to work either. So if you're a publisher, you have to try lots and lots of new things and be prepared to adapt. And you have to think as well about a world of cross-subsidy. You know, news is, one of the things we say in the report is news has always been about cross-subsidy. It was just usually cross-subsidy within the package. If you no longer have the package, how are you going to find the other streams of revenue to support important journalism? And that's a really difficult question for American journalism because it's grown up in a time where it's been possible to sustain journalism without significant public intervention. You know, there is a public service broadcaster in the US, but it's very different from how we would have a mixed economy of journalism in Europe, where, you know, a lot of journalists are funded either through license fee or through, you know, kind of tax breaks or through direct government funding. And that's a different world.
As you know, I think you know that many Italian newspapers are subsidized by the government, by the state.
Yes, that's not quite so good.
What do you think of that?
Well, you know, I think that the key question here is mixed economy. So in America, the idea of having a government directly investing in newspapers is horrifying. And they would actually point to Italy and say, we don't want that. We don't want to be under government control. It's very, very bad for freedom of expression. Probably the most healthy or vibrant news ecologies are those which have some form of subscription, some form of advertising, and some form of intervention around market failure. Yeah, and you know, but there are two competing models. You know, there's definitely an American free market model, and there's also the more European mixed economy. But getting the balance of all of those right is really important for plurality.
Since we're talking about business models, I mean, because we'd like to survive as news organizations, while we're trying to change.
Yeah.
Of course, we have to transform ourselves and change, and we have to
Yeah.
hurry up. We know that.
Yes.
But in the meantime, what do you think of experiments like ProPublica, experiments where foundations, sponsors actually pay?
I'm glad you mentioned ProPublica, actually, because I remember very clearly when there were two news organizations that started in the United States that everybody, even sort of digital prophets, said stood no chance whatsoever. And one of them was ProPublica, and one of them was Huffington Post. And actually, they've both been much more durable than anybody could have possibly imagined. ProPublica is a really interesting example because it was generally thought that if you were going to do public interest journalism, that it shouldn't be backed. It was wrong to have it backed by philanthropists, the Sandlers, I think in this case, who gave one large donation. There's, not-for-profit is still a business model. You still have to get out there and you have to raise the money. But ProPublica does a lot of the things that we already, that we talk about in the report, as does the Texas Tribune, which is like a ProPublica model but done in Texas. It works collaboratively with existing news organizations. It uses phenomenally interesting and new techniques to generate stories. It understands how to intersect, if you like, sort of very hardcore, what they call data reporting with social networks. And you might call it crowdsourcing, but they've done several very innovative projects recently. During the election, they had a sort of a way of verifying the contracts drawn up between advertising super PACs and television stations, which it's not possible for one news organization to sort through all of those. So they asked people to verify and structure the information on each of these PDFs and put it into a database so they could get a proper picture of what was happening and who was funding this advertising all over the country. And they gave T-shirts away and things like that, and they got classes in J schools to all sort of, you would sit at night and kind of think, oh, well, I'll do a couple of those contracts. And they've just done another experiment with narrative science, who, again, we talk about in the report, who automatically generate stories out of data. And they did it on 53,000 school reports. And they said, it's not possible, doesn't scale to have humans doing this. So let's try an algorithm. And I did ask someone at ProPublica, well, why would you do that? And he said, there are some people who don't like to read tabular information, and they deserve to have good information about their schools. So if an algorithm can write out what's contained in those tables in a sensible format, then, why not do that as well? And the Huffington Post, we all know, has so far scaled and was bought by AOL. And again, people said it's never going to last. So, experimentation is always worth doing.
Someone asks something that I find very interesting. We talked about journalists and reporters, but we haven't talked about editors in the newsroom.
Yeah.
So if the skills and relationship of the journalists are changing, how should the editors that keep the newsroom going change?
Oh, I'm really pleased you asked that, because we put one line in the whole report about editors, which I don't think anybody would read, and it was the one thing that people kept coming on and asking me about, because we said, you can't afford, often the editors are the most senior and expensive people in a newsroom. And from my experience of being an editor, you do make some important decisions, but you also spend a lot of your time in meetings with other editors, deciding how to control the resource and plan for space and things like that. A lot of that's going to go away as part of your job description. I think there is a very important role for editors in deciding how to curate all of this content. But we also said that we thought, and this was very controversial, that editors have to be producers as well. That you have to people will want to see the meta process of how you produce news. And editors are really great people. I'm waiting for the first really effective desk editor who posts frequently on how decisions are being made about stories. Not reveal sources or anything like that, but actually describes the process, because you hold all of that in your head all day. And as most editors have this kind of an incredible kind of font of knowledge, both about why some stories are valuable and why others aren't, why this source is good, why that source isn't. They need to be kind of actually making that part of the news brand, making that visible in something other than just story choice and layout. And as I say, you know, actually, editors spend a lot of time doing things that would be better done by, you know, by machines. I mean, you know, really interesting that if you allowed live metrics to make some more of your decisions, you would free up a lot of time to think more about individual stories.
That's very interesting.
Controversial.
There's Matthew Ingram over there, I think, in the corner that wants to ask a question.
Hi, Emily. 2 questions, sort of related. You mentioned Andrew Sullivan. Do you think that he's, A, going to succeed? And do you think that he is sort of a unicorn, or can other people who aren't Andrew Sullivan follow that model?
Well, is he going to succeed? I think it's, you know, I wouldn't put his chances at better than 50-50. I might put them at slightly worse than 50-50. 2 reasons for that, one of which is he wanted $950,000 to make themselves sustainable in the first year. And I think they raised about $600,000 or $650,000, and he posts all of the updates on his blog. That's quite a lot of money to keep renewing every year and to keep going. So, you know, and he's working in an area where there are already many other people working, you know, in that political arena of political discourse. It's a highly competitive area. So I think there's a question about whether or not what he does is specialist enough and whether or not his personal following is strong enough. Is he a unicorn? No, not necessarily. I think that we see lots of very narrow and deep websites now, often which actually they don't configure quite around one person's personality in the same way that Andrew Sullivan's does, but they're often sort of focused around 1 or 2 people. And Nate Silver is an example of that. He just went in the opposite direction. You know, he sort of grew a business out of 538, you know, in the same way that Andrew Sullivan has a business in the Daily Dish. Arguably, the right relationship is with something that can sustain those kind of specialist relationships. It's, you know, in an ideal world, you would have publishers who, like the New York Times and 538, were able to, you know, give life and sort of sustenance to those kind of individual endeavors in a more kind of, you know, shared risk, shared profitability way. And I suspect that that's what we'll end up with. I suspect that we'll end up with many more people doing those kind of, you know, Grantland actually is a good example. Bill Simmons at ESPN has done exactly, again, sort of the same thing of sort of breaking himself out of one brand going and sort of saying, you know, I want to do this, it's my thing. They employ something like 40 people now, and yes, it's under the ESPN umbrella, but it's also, I suspect, a sustainable business on its own. There aren't very many people doing it at the moment, but I think we'll definitely see more.
Are there any other questions in the room? Yes, please, go ahead.
Emily, about 5 years ago in the US, started an experience in training as kind of a consortium among some journalism school called News 21. Do you know that experience, and what's the consideration you
Sorry,
got?
I'm not sure. I didn't quite hear that question.
The News 21
Oh, News 21, the night, yes.
Yeah. What do you think after some years of that experience?
Well, the students of ours who did the News 21, which was almost this idea of a kind of like, again, and that was a studio. It's like a studio challenge for students, which happened at the end of their courses in the summer, and it was run by the Knight Foundation, who are not only kind of support us and our work, but support a great deal of sort of new thinking and ideas in American journalism. I thought it was a really valuable collaboration. I thought that all of the student journalists who took part in it got a tremendous amount out of it. And I know some of them who worked in our unit of News 21 really sort of two things. You know, they got their work published, and I think in one case actually kind of won awards for it. And they formed, again, this kind of network. And I think all of those activities, which sees this sort of teaching hospital model, as we call it in the States, the teaching hospital model of news, where you have journalism schools actually producing and becoming part of the news ecosystem, are really valuable. And I think that was a good kind of kick-off experiment for it, which, you know, could grow into something much more, I think, sort of broad and significant.
There's a question here in front. In the meantime, while you get the microphone, can I ask you a question that arises from Twitter? Has Twitter shortened readers' attention span for in-depth news?
Well, I don't know what the attention span for in-depth news ever was. I always think it was quite short. I think that Twitter actually just fits most people's existing attention spans for news. I mean, you know, we were always given news at the length that suited the broadcast or suited the page layout that fitted the advertising. I don't know about anybody else here, I read so much more, and particularly so much more long-form journalism because of Twitter. You know, I will read, I found myself reading, oh God, some very lengthy, like a review of an album from the 70s that the Rolling Stone had produced that I sort of didn't even know existed, because people recommend and find and share stuff. I do think there's an important point there, though, that breaking news is something where we've had this existential debate going on in journalism about how live is healthy for journalism. How quick should we be? Are we now too quick? You know, I think that's a completely redundant debate. You know, you have to be really quick and you have to be really good. You know, people don't want to wait for information. You know, and why should they? The most valuable markets in the world revolve around access to real-time information. You know, if you look at the stock markets, if you look at how Bloomberg and Reuters and people like that provide information, if you're crossing the road, you don't want to know whether it's safe 5 minutes after you've crossed the road. And I do think that this idea that live is, sometimes it's done really badly, and that's an argument against it, but in general, everybody, whether you're involved in long form or whether you're involved, you know, if you're involved in any type of journalism, you have to be part of the conversation. And the conversation takes place in real time, and it often takes place in networks which are not owned by your news organization. So, you know, increasingly journalists, even if you're not producing news in short bursts, and not everything can be told in short bursts, and nor should it be, but you have to be there creating context for yourself and your authority in your work, so that people trust you when you make an intervention, when you give them longer, better, more sustained pieces of journalism. I mean, you know, I honestly think Twitter is sort of, it is the most significant invention for journalism since the telephone. I really genuinely believe that.
Please go ahead.
The industrial journalism model had a tidy separation of church and state between the people doing the journalism and the people raising the filthy lucre that supports journalism.
I don't think people are hearing you. Can you raise your voice?
Is this better? Okay.
Yeah.
The industrial journalism model had a separation of church and state between the people doing the journalism and the people raising the filthy lucre that supports journalism. With the evolving models, so many of them more the personal brand and those sorts of things, what are some of the ethical challenges that moving the journalism and the funding closer together have created, and how well do you think we're addressing those?
I think it's a great question, because, you know, the answer is that there are ethical challenges in all that all the time, and we can all think of examples where, I mean, there's a huge, there's a huge kind of movement at the moment in the States towards saying, you know, part of the answer is something called native advertising, which is content that's produced with and for advertisers, but done really by the editorial staff of an organization. And it's not really new. We've always had advertising supplements. When I was at The Guardian, we used to produce microsites, you know, in the olden days, for advertisers as well. But you're right, which is, you know, the stream and the personality of the journalist and where they're funded I think, it's become so much more important to be completely transparent about all of that. And I don't think transparency is something that you can opt into or opt out of as a journalist. It's going to be done to you whether you like it or not. You just have to decide how you're going to adopt and, what kind of stance you're going to adopt in response to it. So, I mean, one example of this, which has been quite controversial in the States, is in the tech blogging community, Michael Arrington, who's very sort of famous for having founded TechCrunch, and equally famous for saying very publicly and with no apology, yeah, I take money from tech firms who sponsor us, and I don't really see a problem with that. And obviously, kind of other journalists say, well, I would have a huge problem with that, and I would want to know where your money came from, and, how should we trust you, and why is it, And I think that, we see these kind of ethically shifting models. The crucial sort of decision you have to make, I think, is, are you fully honest and transparent about your funding? And I think if you are, then you will almost certainly have a larger, more sort of sustainable audience than if you're not, because it becomes a point of competitive advantage. And I think that, the best publishers are using new techniques to bring advertising into, this new model and making it a bit more relevant. But I think they're also being very open about what they're doing and very honest about where it works and where it doesn't work.
There's another question right here in front.
In italiano però, mi dispiace. Se ho ben capito, in un passaggio prima ha detto che i giornali, l'integrazione delle redazioni non ha alcuna prospettiva, anzi è un errore perché frena sia il giornale tradizionale che lo sviluppo digitale. Allora io, guardando chiaramente all'Italia, dove tutti i giornali stanno lavorando molto sull'integrazione delle redazioni per compensare la perdita della carta e andare sul digitale, ecco, secondo lei questa è una strada sbagliata? Che cosa dovrebbero fare i medi giornali tradizionali?
Let me tell you the question.
Integration.
He said if newsroom integration has no future, what should Italian newsrooms do? I mean, we are all trying to integrate.
Yes, disintegrate.
We should disintegrate.
It's, well,
this is a nice tweet. I think someone is going to tweet this.
Yes.
I mean, it's very easy and short.
It is, disintegrate. The problem if you integrate, the problem if you don't integrate is that you end up with often two different products with different sensibilities. And the problem if you integrate is that you end up with two products with the same sensibility. And I think, the jury had, so I was quoting Clark Gilbert, who I heard speaking last week, but this is something that we had in our report on business models for digital journalism, where we said people tend to make faster progress if they have not integrated all of their digital functions with all of their newsroom functions. I think really hard about why you're doing it and what where are you building a bridge to when you integrate a newsroom? If you accept that print is going away in one form or another at some point in the not too distant sort of middle future, then, and if you accept that digital operations are becoming much more about mobile models, and they're much more about unsure revenue streams, it doesn't really make much sense to tie those together. It might make perfect sense to co-cite them. It might make perfect sense for each side to know exactly what everybody's doing. It makes perfect sense for journalists, who are, after all, the kind of the raw materials, to work for both. It doesn't make any sense to tie those systems together, because the speed at which digital publishing is changing is so much faster than these large systems can adapt to it. So, I think it's a kind of a bet. I think the integrated newsroom is a bet on a future that we thought might be sustainable in about 2005, 2006, and which probably we now know is not. And if you're in the middle of an integration plan, it feels like it's the right thing to do. Everybody is integrating. Jill Abramson at the same conference, the ISOJ in Austin last week, said, you know, our newsroom integration has worked, and you know, it's not whether to integrate, it's how you do it. You know, I think it's, I still think that you'll see a trend now of people saying, you know, don't integrate. Find another way of balancing those sensibilities. Sometimes it's a forced cost-cutting measure, but again, the big question is to where? You know, you cut and you integrate and you make a website and you make a newspaper out of the same sort of floor, but that can't be where you're ultimately heading, because we think that that's probably not a sustainable model.
Well, there's another question there, but I mean, I need to ask you something, because I mean, we're all trying to integrate. I mean, the word in Italy has been integration. Yeah. So what is your, I mean, your forecast for our future? I mean, if we don't follow your recipe, how much time do we have?
Oh, no pressure. That's a very easy question. You know, it's very difficult. So, okay, so one of the things that we say, the reason we call it post-industrial journalism is we do say there's no silver bullet and there's no one solution that fits everybody. So if I was you and I was in an industry that was all trying to do the same thing, I would be quite worried. Equally, if I was to tell you the same thing is going to happen to all of you, that's probably not true. I mean, how much time do you have? I don't know. It depends on, you have a language advantage here. You know, in the Anglophone world, there is there's a much kind of more competitive kind of global environment. You know, The Guardian can compete with the New York Times, can compete with Al Jazeera English. You know, so there are pockets of the market which are a little bit protected from some of this. But overall, it's not dictated by things like that. It's dictated by what are your readers and audience doing? You know, what is the demographic of your readership and how are they getting their news? If they're under 25 and you are not reaching them effectively on social platforms through mobile phones, they will never know that you are there. They will not care about your journalism, and they will have no idea who your journalists are, because that's how young people consume and share and read news. And that trend can be met by publishers who are adapting their systems. Now, if you think you can kind of get to that future by integrating your newsroom, then go ahead. But as I say, you know, the empirical evidence so far is that integration does not allow for the right degree of purely digital thinking and speed to keep up with where the market is necessarily going. How long have you got with print? In the US now, we have a market in New Orleans, which is the first major sort of size of city that does not have a daily newspaper. The Times-Picayune has gone to publishing, Steve probably knows it, 3 days a week. And Advanced Media, who own them, are replicating that in other properties, as are other regional newspapers. There isn't a single news organization that I know of in either the UK or the US who is not actively contemplating moderating or cutting print. And if they say they're not, then I don't believe them. And I think that might still be another decade of transition to that. But I don't think that there's anybody currently sitting in news who thinks that print is going to be sort of, you know, sustainable and exactly where it is in 20 years' time. And I'll tell you a leading indicator for that as well, that if you look at what people are doing on the markets, Rupert Murdoch has divided his company into the publishing, which does have digital assets into it, but basically the newspaper company, and to the digital company. And you will see over and over again, Time Inc. is doing exactly the same thing. You know, if you're BuzzFeed and you're Jonah Peretti, you can raise money in the market. If you have a newspaper, it's much harder. You know, nobody out there believes that these things are worth investing in, which is making it very, very difficult for the news industry to kind of raise money to make some of the changes that people who are not encumbered with legacy products are able to experiment with or change it. You know, this is not easy. There isn't. I don't think there's a. As I say, there's one version of this which is pretty catastrophic, which says your newspapers are not sustainable and neither are the things that are going to replace them. You know, that there'll have to be a sort of a clear out in the market. But I would say that, you know, if you're looking beyond a 10-year horizon in which a merged and integrated newsroom is healthily producing web and newspapers, I think you're probably living in a fantasy world. Sorry.
Thank you.
I can say this is academic freedom. I could never say this as a newspaper executive.
Another myth that, I think there's another question coming there. Another myth that I'd like to hear from you about. I mean, do you think it's really important that people click the links on Twitter? I mean, we have this idea in newspapers that we have to tweet the links so that people click through and go on the website, and so we get advertising revenue. But we saw the percentages of click-throughs are very small, and you know, much more people come on websites through Facebook than Twitter. Is that important, you think, or it doesn't matter? We should care more about being there.
Well, you can't force an audience to do what it doesn't want to do, and if all you're doing is sending out a kind of a hose pipe of links to your own material, nobody's going to click on them. I wouldn't click on them. If every time you see somebody's tweet it goes, read this, I've just written it, it's great, you know, I'm sorry. If, however, somebody who you trust and who is, you know, an authoritative journalist in any particular field, who regularly supplies you with great links from everywhere, says, oh, I wrote this thing, you might be interested in it, here's a link, then I will click. You know, it's like people are not idiots. They can tell the difference between what's good quality information and when somebody is genuinely engaged with giving them what they think is interesting versus doing what they're told to do by the newsroom. You know, it's like, if you came up to me and started telling me how great everything was, you know, that you'd written in the last 5 years, I might believe you, and it probably would be great. But I would also think, this is a bit odd, I'm being sort of advertised to. Right. You know, so I think that, again, it's not, and is it important that you keep everything on your site and you're not out there in the network? I mean, again, it's just very difficult, because if you're not in those networks, you're not in the conversation, you're not, you know, go back to the 75% of people who are sharing news by word of mouth, go back to all of those people in St. Peter's Square who are taking pictures and putting them on their Facebook pages. That's where people are finding their news. If you're a news organization and you're not there, then, you know, you might be lucky and have people finding you independently, but mostly that's not going to happen. So to have any chance in this, you have to be really responsive to what the audience is doing and thinking, and where they're active.
Please. One last question over there, because I was just told we have very little time. So.
I'm sorry to say that after 1.5 hours, but I don't get it. When you foresee the rise of individual journalism and the decline of organized journalism, it has been my understanding so far that organized journalism has two advantages. One is the brand, market recognition. When you say Guardian or Spiegel or anything, everybody knows the brands here and has some idea what kind of journalism it is. But second, much more important, is the division of labor within organized journalism. You have different experts in one room. You have not only that, you have spell checkers, you have people who take care about your bills, about your expenses. You have lawyers who defend you against aggressive companies, politicians, or whatsoever who don't like your articles and your whatever. Why don't you see, why do you think this necessity of division of labor, of organized journalism, and these advantages aren't given anymore, and why do you see the rise of individual journalism there?
Okay. Two things. Some of what you've described in terms of what composes collective effort is not going to, you're not going to be able to afford to do that. So part of this is a defensive move, right? You know, if you have spell checkers, that's great. I can guarantee in 5 years' time you will not have spell checkers, that all of that will be done automatically. I can guarantee that if you have people writing small standard market reports from statistics that come through the door, you will not have those people in 5 years' time. You will have an algorithm doing it because you won't be able to afford the human labor involved in it, right? The organizing principle has to be around, I think, the individual. But I did say that, you know, the survival of the institution for some of the functions you're talking about is also really important. Legally, in terms of archive, just in terms of continuity of stories. You know, people sort of come and go, and you need a thread that moves through that. So we're not anti-institutional. We're just saying the way that institutions tend to be organized at the moment are around a packaged process with lots and lots of people involved in it. And we just don't see how that's possibly going to be scalable or survivable. I mean, I'll give you a sort of a parallel instance, which is if you think about what happened to the games development industry. So when you were developing a computer game, kind of 20 years ago, whatever it was, these were done by big studios, and they had enormous overheads, and everybody working on the game was an employee of the company, and you would work for maybe a year to get one game out, and it was packaged and sold on shelves for a large amount of money, and it had to be a hit. Otherwise, it's like the film industry. Otherwise, you were kind of doomed. And what's happened to that process over time is that you now have games developers with you still have brands, but you have games developers with very specific skills who come together and work in a completely kind of virtual way around a project that they might want to do. And they iterate many, many, many more games, most of which are online, most of which have kind of, some sort of viral life. None of which now come, kind of completely sort of contained and sealed in a box as, and have no other kind of, online iteration. These processes in industrial creative production are no different to mining or shipbuilding or agriculture. All of those industries have, motor cars, have undergone really significant changes to the scale of the workforce and the nature of the workflow and the nature of the skills of the people involved. Why journalism thinks it is completely immune to that, I have no idea, because it obviously isn't and can't be. And I think that, so it's not anti-institutional, it's saying your real value is going to reside in your people. And what your people can do will be much more effective with the number of tools that they have and the network that they can reach. So, why are you organizing around a process and thinking we have to have this massive scale when actually, you're not going to be able to afford the massive scale and you have to rethink those systems?
Okay, so we're going to have to wrap this up. But basically, I would like to tell the audience here that the report, since you just said that journalism is not immune to the post-industrial revolution, yeah. And so since many of us here are journalists, we have to hurry up and learn quickly how to change and how to evolve if we don't want to be
journalists are fine. It's all the editors and the consultants who are going to be in a the report that Emily Bell wrote with C.W. Anderson and Clay Shirky is called Post-Industrial Journalism Adapting to the Present. It's online. It's for free. You can read it. And let me ask you just one last question, because you're not only the director of a center in a journalism school, you're also a journalist, and you just recently wrote on The Guardian a wonderful piece that I think, we're two women here, but I think, I'm sorry if the male audience here might feel a bit offended, but you wrote a wonderful article that was very polemical with the article that Politico wrote, yes, on Jill Abramson in the newsroom and misogyny in the newsroom at the New York Times. Yes.
Can you synthesize what you said? You basically defended her very well, and in a way, I'm not sure if your point of view was more criticizing Politico or Jill Abramson's colleagues in the New York Times?
Well, I don't know actually what happened with Jill Abramson's colleagues in the New York Times, and I'm making no judgment on her editorship apart from the fact she has won 4 Pulitzers, and the paper seems to be, as actually somebody at the New York Times said to me, the paper seems to be better than it ever has been, so we're a little bit puzzled about where things are going wrong. No, it was just about it was really about Politico's use of language, about thinking it was okay to publish a piece where there was great discontent at the New York Times newsroom. That might be right. But then every single piece of evidence produced for this was about Jill Abramson's manner or the way that she spoke to people. They said she was snappy, condescending, impossible. In a meeting with some editorial colleagues, she told one of them to go and fix the problem rather than sit there. And somebody said to me, congratulations, she's definitely a newspaper editor. You know, but these all seem as relevant if you're female, or relevant grounds for criticism. So, so I ran an experiment, which is you just change the name from Jill to Jack, and then you read the piece, and it seemed like no editor would have ever allowed you to post it because it was so absurd. So that was the story behind that. And also, I got very cross, and then an editor said, "Could you just write that down in an hour?" So that's how the best journalism gets done.
Yeah, it was a wonderful piece. I think we all will cut it out and paste it in our newsrooms, because in Italy we have
in your non-existent newsrooms.
Exactly.
You put it on your bedroom. Put it on your bedroom wall.
Thank you very much. And with this, we're wrapping up. Thank you, Emily Bell.
Thank you. Thank you. Before the top line points, I've got some alluring visuals for you. Maybe. Oh, hang on, I've gone too far. Right, so, spoiled the joke. So first of all, why post-industrial? So the first observation that we made is the most obvious one, but we felt it really needed saying, which news journalism isn't an industry anymore. It just isn't. You used to be able to walk into the smallest local newspaper or local radio or television organization and the largest in the country, and they would kind of look more or less the same. You know, the production processes were all about getting stories from one end of the pipe to the other and producing packages. And they were produced in places like this. This is actually quite a modern newsroom. This is something that was sort of reconfigured, and I think it might even be the Telegraph newsroom in London. And this is sort of state of the art, but this is not really fit for the future. If you think that, sorry, people on live stream, if you think that all reporting now, or you can report a story very effectively with an iPhone, then something like this begins to look incredibly outdated. So we really mean that the fragmentation of practices and downscaling of size means that while we still have a profession, we still have a field of journalism, but it's just not organized either on an industrial scale or as a recognizable set of processes which you can replicate everywhere with a predictable... Good morning. Sorry, there's something enormously ironic about giving a talk about post-industrial journalism with so much electronic equipment, much of which doesn't work as it should. First of all, I want to say thank you very much indeed to the International Journalism Festival for having me here. This is actually the first time, I think, I was going to say it's the first time I've ever said anything in a church. I think I did get married, so it's probably not absolutely the first time I've said something in a church, but certainly the first time I've said anything in a church where I wasn't worried that the outcome was going to ruin the rest of my life. My marriage is still very good after all those years. So, my name's Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. The centre's inside the J School, so we do a number of things. I teach at the J School, so does my fellow professor in the Tower Centre. We have a research programme which looks into, called the Town Light Projects, which we've just launched, which looks into areas of interest, particularly around data transparency and impact in the digital age. And we also look at convening and generating conversations around what's going on in the field at the moment, because we are, as you know, living through a ridiculously exciting time. Before I came to Columbia, I was a journalist. I've been a career journalist, I've been a print journalist, and I've been an online journalist. I was a business reporter for a number of years, and in 2000, I moved from the Observer newspaper week, so I'm wondering what they... Bill Gruskin, our academic dean, on business models for digital journalism. Now, both those reports had a very key theme which ran through them, which is the age of high revenues coming into news is over, and it's not coming back. So our report was looking at what happens when you get into this downsized world, where you have to sort of start thinking about operating on much lower resources. It's not a report specifically about business models, but at the front of the report we say, we think that the advertising model is failing, and for subscription models, again, there is no necessary evidence that these are working either. What we think, though, is that this shift, if you like, in sizing of news organizations is permanent and irreversible. So whatever comes next has to have a different model, and it has to have a different size. The cost base for journalism will have to be much smaller. I don't think there's anybody now in the industry who thinks that this is even debatable. And it would be very surprising if news organizations were investing to grow the number of employees they have and to grow the basis on which they produce their work. So what I wanted to do this morning, actually, can I just retrieve my water so that I don't dry up completely? That one, thanks. What I wanted to do this morning was just talk through which Sunday newspaper in Britain to The Guardian, where I became the head of Guardian Online, sort of the editor-in-chief of the websites, and then later on the director of digital content. And between 2000 and 2010, we did a great deal of things at The Guardian that were, I think, sort of quite innovative at the time. I was lucky to do them in an organization which had great leadership and which had a slightly different business model than some of my counterparts in very commercial companies. We were owned by a trust. We didn't have to return profits to a shareholder. So it gave me an opportunity to try out and think about and work with teams who were trying very new things, for what was then very new things in the field of journalism. Last year was our centennial year at the journalism school. That means that we had been going for 100 years. It was 100 years since Joseph Pulitzer gave Columbia money to start the journalism school. And we were commissioned by our dean, Nick Lemon, to produce a report which, and we were very careful never to use the phrase future of journalism in the report, because I think it's an overused phrase, and also because that suggested that we were going to come up with some solutions, which, if you read our 122-page report, Post-Industrial Journalism, you'll notice we cleverly avoid making very, very strong recommendations about what you should do with your newsroom. But we were commissioned a report to look at what we think is actually happening right now in journalism and how practices and existing institutions might adapt to that future. I co-authored a report with Clay Shirky, who many of you probably know from his work talking about and lecturing on the real-time social web. He's a professor also at NYU and works both in the ITP program there and the journalism program. And C.W. Anderson, he's Chris Anderson, but there are so many Chris Andersons, we now call him C.W. He's an academic who, again, teaches in CUNY J School, and his area of, or field of expertise is really looking at news organizations. He's just produced a book about the news ecology in Philadelphia. So it was a really sort of unique collaboration for us, because it was New York's 3 J schools coming together and looking at what we thought was going to happen, or was happening in front of our eyes. And we spent about 6 months. This is not a strictly speaking academic report. It's more like a long essay. And we spent about 6 months talking to 50+ individuals and organizations of all different types. Some of these are very traditional, large news agencies and news organizations. Some of them were sort of one-man bands or one-woman bands and startups. And throughout that sort of process, we gained, I think, a sort of a fairly interesting picture of what was happening in American journalism, and I hope some of that exports reasonably well to Europe and maybe even to the rest of the world, as I noticed that we were being translated into Chinese last